War of the Flea. How guerrilla fighters could win the world. I'm gonna put some resources in the Jumbotron, so if you hear some silence on the recording, that's why. I'm also going to put some mutual aids in the comment section. So give me just 1 second. I'm going to put the PDF of what we're reading in there as well. So let's see what's in there. So I put some resources in the Jumbotron. There's the PDF of what we're reading, a thread of the previous spaces, and as well as the space that's going to for Monday for Death of a King in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King. And then there's also a thread that I want y'all all to look at. So a person on here by the at Black Kate Bush has been being harassed with anti-Blackness relentlessly for 3 days. I put the post in the Jumbotron to show just a snippet of what they've been going through. So I want everyone to check that out, because this is a type of thing, like I said, if we read about revolutionary text in these spaces, we also have to put that shit to action. And there's no way that a Black woman should be on here constantly harassed by people and everyone watching. She has been getting support, and forgive me, I'm not sure of their pronouns, so I'm going to say they. They have been getting support, but they need a lot more. And one call to action is to block the person that has actually been responsible for all this. I have them blocked now because of this post and because of the work that at Black Kate Bush has done. Because let me not sell them short. The work that they've done to uncover anti-Blackness has opened a lot of eyes, and a lot of people who were benefiting and gaining social capital off of hijacking movements and co-opting them while themselves being anti-Black has opened a lot of eyes on this app. So because of at Black Kate Bush, I was able to clean up a lot of my followers and to make sure to avoid a lot of anti-Black people. So that thread is in the Jumbotron. I encourage everyone to look at it. And real quick, I'm going to put a few mutual aids in the comment section. If anyone sees any mutual aids that have not been getting that much attention or have not been closed out and their needs met, please include that in the comment section as well, so that other people in the space can share them and support them in every way possible. So I'm going to do a few. Give me just a second. I'm going to be quiet because I have them bookmarked just so I can put them there. Okay, I have one. Oh, hey, Four Cups, let me get your mic. And I'll go ahead and start reading. Four Cups, did you want to help me read today?
Yes.
Perfect. So then once you start reading, I'll put more mutual aids in the comment section that I found and bookmarked. Before we go, I did want to read something from, let me pull it up. Okay. Sekou Odinga, I wanted to read a poem from him. It's called Looking. And it says, what can be said of warriors besides thank you? Or maybe words aren't of any use at all. Still, silence seems disrespectful too. Pigs came knocking and caught your shadow in a glimpse, in a whisper. Rumors of you spread over radios, spread across every borough and then straight over the Atlantic to the brinks of liberation movements at the high stage war here and there is all the same when you know which side of the empire you stand. Those of us who know enough know better than to say goodbye or think this is over. Your enemies still stand tall, and we got breath in our lungs, so it's work to do. Your forever age, the same year Asada went free enough to elude cold captivity. Muslim new Africans, freedom fighters, may you rest and may we know no peace. Till we've done what George said must be done, or until we can see glimpses of you in stormwater, some proud whirlwind of ancestors come back to witness the freed nation they fought for. The world molded more humane from their sacrifice. So yeah, I wanted to read that. I'm also going to put that in the Jumbotron. And from there, I'm going to go ahead and start reading. And 4 cups we can do every 2 pages each, if that's cool. So
That's perfect. I'm fine with that.
cool. So we're on chapter 5, Colonial War and the Experience, Strategy, and Tactics of Vo Win Gaia. I think I said that totally wrong if someone can tell me the right way. It's Nguyen, and then the next word is GIAP, and how the Vietnam won in Indochina. Oh, Viet Minh won in Indochina. And it's page, on the PDF it says 59, but then the tag says, I believe, 61. So that's where we're starting from. How do the laws of Revolutionary War laid down by Mao Zedong apply to the remaining colonies of the great powers? The answer is implicit in the historical record. During the 2 decades since the Second World War, no colonial war has been lost by a colonial people once entered into. Malaya and the Philippines are only apparent exceptions, not real ones. They will be discussed in a later chapter. In the more fortunate instances, the colonial powers have ceded their authority in good time, bowing before the wind of history. Elsewhere, revolutionary action has wrested the erstwhile colonies away by the extortion of terror and civil disorder, as in Cyprus and Morocco, or by clear force of arms, as in Algeria and Indochina. The struggle against the French colonial power in Indochina is of a special interest. In it, we find the most clear-cut examples both of the sort of revolutionary war that must be fought to a military decision, as opposed to the insurgency that ends in political decision, and of a war fought consciously and even conscientiously according to Mao's perceptions. As Katzenbach remarks, the war of the Viet Minh, followers of Ho Chi Minh, fought in northern Indochina followed Mao's teachings phase by phase, despite the claims of Viet Minh leaders that they improved on the doctrine. The struggle lasted in 1946, when Ho Chi Minh took up arms against the French invasion. Actually, he had taken virtual possession of Vietnam the year before with the surrender of the Japanese to British, Chinese, and native forces. Until 1954, when the country was partitioned at the 17th parallel under the terms of the international agreement reached at Geneva, following the fall of the French stronghold of Dien Bien Phu. Sorry if I said that wrong, y'all. If the outcome of the war represented something less than a complete victory for the communist Viet Minh, it nevertheless spelled absolute defeat for the French and marked the end of French rule in Vietnam. Although the bulk of the 500,000-man French Expeditionary Corps remained intact, 172,000 casualties in 8 years of fighting, its spirit was broken, and the political compromise that followed failed to disguise the fact that French arms had met in I do not know how to say that word, ignominious defeat in the field at the hands of what had been considered a ragtag native army that could be smashed in 10 weeks. Basically, the imperial power, which is the French, got their asses whooped by people that they considered to just be farmers and goat herders. But like we've read in previous chapters, anytime the people stand up against an oppressive power, when everything aligns, it goes in their favor. Even a concession that the empire has to make, depending if the people take advantage of that concession, is all strategic. But basically, he's drawing a parallel that when the people stand up, they have nothing to lose but their chains, is basically what we're reading over and over. And he's going to give more examples in this chapter. During 8 years of battle, the Viet Minh passed from a movement of scattered guerrilla bands operating in company or even in platoon strength to a regular army of mobile divisions armed with light artillery and equal in organization and fighting ability to the best that the French could put into the field. But while the final phase, the strategic offensive described by Mao, was fought by such an army, by far the great part of the long campaign was guerrilla warfare. The definition of guerrilla warfare offered by General Vo Nguyen Gaia, the victor of Dien Bien Phu, concurs with Mao. Even the rhetoric is the same. He says, Guerrilla war is the form of fighting by the masses of a weak and badly equipped country against an aggressive army with better equipment and techniques. This is the way of fighting a revolution. Guerrillas rely on heroic spirit to triumph over modern weapons, avoiding the enemy when he is the stronger and attacking him when he is the weaker. Now scattering, now regrouping, now wearing out, now exterminating the enemy, they are determined to fight everywhere, so that whatever or wherever the enemy goes, he is submerged in a sea of armed people who hit back at him, thus undermining his spirit and exhausting his forces. Fortunately for his cause, Goliath had absorbed the practical wisdom as well as the political rhetoric of his mentor, so that he is on solid ground when he writes. In addition to scattering to wear out the enemy, it is necessary to regroup big armed forces in favorable situations to achieve supremacy in attack at a given point in time to annihilate the enemy. Successes in many small fights added together gradually wear out the enemy manpower, while little by little strengthening our forces. The main goal of the fighting must be destruction of enemy manpower. Our own manpower should not be exhausted from trying to keep or occupy land. Gaiev's definition of his objectives is purely military. In a colonial situation, the political effects of guerrilla war are less important, perhaps, than in a war against the native government of a semi-colonial country such as Cuba. Certainly, there are less important in the case of a nation defending itself against an invader, France's role after the Second World War. But this is to speak of the effects of the struggle on government morale and on world opinion. Clearly, the primary political task, choked. Clearly, the primary political task of militating the people, retaining the same vital importance in Vietnam as anywhere, a fact which Gaiep himself recognizes. Writing of the first years of the oh, I'm so sorry, 4 cups. I went way past 2 pages. I'll finish.
No, I noticed that. I was just gonna ask you. We can just do 3 to 3.
Ooh, sorry about that. Okay, writing the first years of the long guerrilla campaign, he says that in the beginning, there appeared a tendency not to take into due account the part played by political work, and the political workers did not yet grasp the fact that the main task was political education and ideological leadership. Later, however, the terror was perceived and due attention was paid to the key political problem, that of uniting the nation in all of its social sectors and joining all ethnic groups in a multinational country against foreign domination. The party strove hard to avail itself of favorable opportunities to push the people into the struggle. Yep relates the considerable candor. And again, the National United Front was to be a vast assembly of all the forces capable of being united, neutralizing all those which could be neutralized, dividing all those it would be possible to divide. Early neglect of the peasantry was quickly rectified in the face of the realities of a war in a peasant country. And agrarian reform, with the slogan, "Land to the tillers," became a rallying cry for the revolution. The enemy of the Vietnamese nation, writes Gale, was aggressive imperialism, which had to be overthrown. But as the imperialists had long since joined with the feudal landlords, the anti-imperialist struggle definitely could not be separated from anti-feudal action. On the other hand, in a backward colonial country such as ours, where the peasants make up the majority of the population, a people's war is essentially a peasants' war under the leadership of the working class. A general mobilization of the whole people is, therefore, neither more nor less than a mobilization of the rural masses. The failure to form a broad popular front, especially one including the religious sects, notably the Buddhists, cost the Viet Minh dearly in South Vietnam at the beginning of the struggle. As we have noted, Ho Chi Minh's guerrilla forces had taken virtual control of the country with the surrender of the Japanese occupation forces of the Second World War. In part because of the defection of the religious sects, the French armored forces landing in South Vietnam met little opposition.
Within a few months, they held much of what was then called Cochin China, Vietnam's southernmost state, of which Saigon is the capital. Only the lack of manpower, 40,000 troops under the command of General Leclerc, comprised the initial expeditionary force prevented them from seizing the flatlands of Annam and Tonkin as well. As the late Bernard Fall, Street Without Joy, and the Two Vietnams remarked, French objectives in Indochina in 1946 envisioned little more than a campaign of colonial reconquest along classic lines like Marshal Lyate's somebody name campaign against Abd el Krim's Rif Kabyles in the 1920s. The method chosen was the so called oil slick technique. It involved the establishment of strong points in a region from which pacification forces would spread out to cut the countryside into small squares and then to comb each square on the grid, working from the outside until the rebel forces within the net were finally brought to close quarters and exterminated. It is, in effect, a police method. The trouble was that Leclerc did not have a sufficient number of policemen for this for the ratissage, the combining without which the whole plan falls to pieces. The French campaign fitted a pattern typical of what must be expected to happen when regular military forces try to combat guerrillas as though they were a conventional military army enemy, or on the other hand, treat them as mere roving bandits to be dispersed by flying columns and picked off one by one. Leclerc's armored columns rushed in, seized the major roads and the important crossroad towns, and felt that they had made a successful start since they met little determined resistance at any point. What they failed to realize initially was that although they controlled the roads, they were fighting an enemy that had no need of roads, being without transport or heavy artillery to move. They seized strong points, but these strong points commanded nothing. Since the enemy was not stationary but fluid and offered no contest for strong points or for territory, the French controlled the roads. The guerrillas passed safely in the jungle and rice paddies on either side at a distance of 100 yards unseen. The French held the towns. The enemy had no design on the towns. For where the French were fighting to control the national territory, that meant to occupy it. The guerrillas were only interested in winning its population. Note, this is the essential contrast between conventional war and guerrilla war. The army fights to occupy territory, roads, strategic heights, vital areas. The guerrillas fights to control people, without whose cooperation the land is useless to its possessor. The oil slick pattern, better for catching bandits than for fighting guerrillas, might actually have been used to some advantage in Indochina. Had the French commanded more troops to devote to the campaign, but in a revolutionary situation, moreover, one in which foreign troops oppose native guerrillas, the suppression campaign could only work locally. What is the method of preventing new outbreaks short of exterminating entire populations? It has yet to be discovered. The Vietnamese casualties that fell before the French were very high. The death toll heavy during 8 years. The French during 8 years of bitter internal war. Dr. Fall estimated Viet Minh casualties at 3 times those of the French Union forces, putting the latter at 172,000. Yet there is strong evidence that the great bulk of the native casualties were not guerrillas, but civilians. The French drive was doomed to failure. The country was too big, the population was too great, and there was too much natural cover for the guerrillas. The French forces were far too small for an effort that requires a minimum ratio of 10 soldiers for every guerrilla and may very well need 20 or 100 in a land where every native is a potential guerrilla fighter. Viet Minh troops were organized on three levels according to the pattern established in China and used elsewhere. At the top were the so called Chu Luk regulars, permanent guerrilla fighters who could be employed strategically wherever needed and who carried the main campaign when insurgent forces were concentrated for a major strike. Beneath the Chuluk were the regional guerrillas who fought only in their own zones and could always return to their civilian character as peasants and workers if hard pressed. And on the bottom level were the village militia, the Dukich guerrillas by night and peasants by day carrying out limited assignments, sabotaging a bridge here, ambushing a patrol there, mining the roads, carrying messages or funds, and fading back into their farms and villages at the first approach of military opposition. At the first shots of imperialist invasion, writes General Giap, General Leclerc estimated that the reoccupation of Vietnam would be a military walkover. When encountering resistance in the South, the French generals considered it weak and temporary and stuck to their opinion that it would take 10 weeks at most to occupy and pacify the whole south of Vietnam. Why did the French colonists make such an estimate? Because they considered that to meet their aggression, they must be an army. It was not possible for them to understand a fundamental and decisive fact. The Vietnamese army, although weak materially, was a people's army. In provoking hostilities, the colonialists had alienated a whole nation. And indeed, the whole Vietnamese nation, the entire Vietnamese people, rose against them. Unable to grasp this profound truth, the French generals who believed in an easy victory went instead to certain defeat. Allowing for rhetorical exaggeration, there is still much in what Giap says. The French forces, concentrating on strong points and other objectives of conventional warfare strategy, found themselves submerged in a sea of armed people. The arms, in the main, came from the French Expeditionary Corps, which, says Giap, became unwittingly the supplier of the Vietnam People's Army with French, even U.S. arms. As for the organization of the resistance, Giap notes that it was primarily political and only secondarily military. Our party advocated that to launch the People's War, it was necessary to have three kinds of armed forces. It attached great importance to the building and development of self defense units and guerrilla units. Militia was set up everywhere. Thanks to the founding of the People's Administration everywhere in the countryside and the existence of party branches in every place, the militia spread far and wide, and the people rose to fight. In the enemy's rear, guerrilla units, in coordination with the regular army, scattered and wore out the enemy, nailed them to their bases so that our regular army could launch mobile fighting to annihilate them. They turned the enemy rear our front line and built guerrilla bases as starting points for our regular army's offensive right in the heart of the enemy. They protected the people and their property, fought the enemy, and kept up production and frustrated the enemy's schemes to use war to feed war and Vietnamese to fight Vietnamese. In the free zones, guerrilla units effectively fought the enemy and kept watch on traitors. They were effective instruments for the local administration and local party. At the same time, they were the shock force in production, transport, and supply. Through combat and work, the guerrilla units became an inexhaustible and precious source of replenishment for the regular army, supplying it with men and officers who were politically well educated and rich in fighting experience. Italics authors. Both sides made serious mistakes in the early stages of the 8 year struggle. The French, for their part, devoted a full 5 months of 1947 to the fruitless task of attempting to capture Ho Chi Minh and his staff, thinking in this way to cut short the war. The effort was wasted.
Mm. Yo, you did a really good job. Let me continue reading. Even if they had captured Ho, it probably would not have affected the course of a war, the outcome of which depended not on individual military genius, but on a strategy dictated by the political military situation, a strategy that any communist leader aware of the lesson of China would have applied. Here, it may be well to observe that, to a very great extent, guerrillas fight as they do because they must. Their situation determines their course of action. Lacking the heavy weapons and disciplined divisions with which to fight conventional military campaigns, they are confined, as Clausewitz puts it, to nibbling at the edges of the opposing army and fighting in the enemy's rear areas. Materially unable to face a military decision, they must of necessity await a political decision. In a revolutionary situation, political decisions will tend to favor their side, since these will come in the course of a protracted war, which the enemy is neither politically nor psychologically able to stand, whatever the condition of his military forces. As General Giap analyzed the situation of the French, the enemy will pass slowly from the offensive to the defensive. The blitz will transform itself into a war of duration. Thus, the enemy will be caught in a dilemma. He has to drag out the war in order to win it, and does not possess, on the other hand, the psychological and political means to fight a long, drawn-out war. Giap, of course, proved to be correct. Political pressures in France, the low morale of the pro-French sector of public opinion in Vietnam, and the sagging morale of the troops themselves as the war dragged on, seriously weakened the efforts of the Expeditionary Corps. The country was swarming with guerrilla militia. Units were organized in virtually every village. Viet Minh regulars were making rapid force marches through the jungle to strike a French column here and a small garrison there, and were rapidly arming new units with weapons seized from the enemy, as well as heavier equipment smuggled from China. By the end of 1949, the French had lost the initiative, and the Viet Minh had seized it to such an extent that the latter were able to launch a limited offensive with 15 battalions, sealing off part of the Red Sea Delta and Tonkin from the Thai Highlands. Damn. In the spring, a large offensive was launched against French defense in the Red River Valley, and by summer, the entire northern corner of Tonkin had been converted into a Vietnamese stronghold. Political pressures in France predictably worked for the Viet Minh. In August 1950, the French government actually ordered a reduction of the French forces in Indochina by 9,000 troops, ignoring the military realities of the situation there entirely. And the National Assembly, yielding to popular anti-war sentiment at home, required assurances that no military conscripts would be used in Indochina. In other words, it was to be a police action carried out by professionals, principally foreign legions, Moroccan, and other non-French troops. The inevitable result was a further weakening of the French war effort and a new offensive on the part of the Viet Minh. An entire string of garrisons in northern Tonkin were cut off from their base. A Moroccan task force of 3,500 men and a garrison force of 2,600 men and 500 civilians seeking to escape from the entrapment were ambushed and destroyed, and 3 battalions of paratroopers sent to their rescue met the same fate. In the 2 Vietnam, Bernard Fall writes, by the end of the month of October 1950, almost the whole northern half of Vietnam had become a Vietnamese redoubt, into which the French were, with the brief exception of a paratroop raid on Long Song in July 1953, never to penetrate again. When the smoke had cleared, the French had suffered their greatest colonial defeat since Montcalm had died at Quebec. They had lost 6,000 troops, 13 artillery pieces, and 125 mortars, 450 trucks, and 3 armored platoons, 940 machine guns, and 1,200 submachine guns, and more than 8,000 rifles. Their abandoned stocks alone sufficed for the equipment of a whole Viet Minh division. Damn. For the French, Fall concludes, the Indochina War was lost then and there. That it was allowed to drag on unconclusively for another 4 years is a testimony to the short-sightedness of the civilian authorities who were charged with drawing the political conclusion from the hopeless military situation. American military aid, the first trickle of which had made its appearance in the form of 7 transport planes in June 1950 after the Korean War had broken out, was to make no difference whatsoever in the eventual outcome of the war. The progress of the Viet Minh was slowed to some extent by General Giap's premature decision at the end of 1950 to begin a general offensive. The attempt to force the campaign into Mao's decisive third stage of revolutionary war, the strategic offensive, when the situation was not yet ripe, cost the Viet Minh heavily. In a single clash in the Red River Delta, January 16 to 17, Giap lost 6,000 men. When he tried to seize the port of Haiphong in March 1951, he was again defeated, and in June, a third drive for control of the Delta likewise failed. Thereafter, the Viet Minh wisely transferred their efforts to more promising objectives, in particular, to control of the highland areas where heavy artillery, air power, and armor could not be brought fully into play, and the French had to fight on the Viet Minh's terms. Smart. The key military problem of the French in Indochina was lack of manpower. Their main political problem was lack of support on the home front. Diplomatic pressures added to these problems. Viet Minh's strategy was flexible. That of the French was comparatively rigid, so that time and again the Expeditionary Corps was caught off balance. Lack of manpower meant that too few troops were required to cover too much territory, with the result that the corps was unable to meet the lightning blows of fast-moving Viet Minh mobile divisions when these concentrated for an offensive. And when the French themselves went on the offensive and tried to concentrate their forces to seize the initiative in a given sector, Viet Minh guerrilla action elsewhere along the line made them spread out again. Moreover, Viet Minh strategy, being political as well as military, was designed to increase the political and psychological pressure on the enemy and was signally successful in accomplishing this objective. My bad. As I'm reading, I'm thinking of like 100 million things, but one movie that keeps occurring is literally my favorite movie of all time, and it's called Spook Who Sat by the Door. It is free on YouTube. I encourage y'all to look at it because actually it's about, I'm not going to give too much away, but it plays into, like, I guess, if you were to imagine guerrilla warfare in an urban setting, which we're also going to read revolutionary books on that, but what would that look like? And it's interesting how they played it out in that movie during the Black exploitation era at that. So the movie is called Spook Who Sat by the Door, and again, it is free on YouTube. But I'll keep reading. The point is well illustrated by Giap's invasion of Laos in the early spring of 1953. The invasion was launched with 3 Viet Minh divisions, supported internally by 4,000. I don't know how to say that word. Sorry, y'all. It's PATHET and I know that LAO is Lao, guerrillas. In opposition were only 3,000 French troops backed by the Laotian army of 10,000 men. Rather than sacrifice the thinly mannered frontier garrisons, the French command ordered them to withdraw, leaving only a single battalion to offer rearguard resistance. The battalion was lost. Only 4 men survived. Another garrison retreating inland lost all but 180 of its 2,400 troops in a disastrous fighting withdrawal. Reinforcements airlifted into Laos from Vietnam stemmed the invasion on the Plain de Jaras, but at the cost of further depleting the French reserves in the main area of hostilities and tying up all available French air transport. The Viet Minh were beaten back, but their campaign was, for the point of view, far from a wasted effort.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Um, as Katzenbach comments in Time, Space, and Will, the results of this action, whether the whole of the intended result was achieved or not, were as far-fetching as if a majority of as if a major victory had been won. Seldom has so much been accomplished with so little. Perhaps in the cold light of afterthought, the most curious aspect of the whole action was that from the beginning it made a mockery of the old saying, nothing risked, nothing gained. Whatever the game, the old saying, whatever the game, no military investment of sizable proportions was risked. This was quite as safe a venture, in a word, as the Chinese invasion of Tibet. Yet after a 3-week invasion, this is what the communists had accomplished. They had thrown terror into the French, military and civil authorities alike, in both Indochina and metropolitan France. They had spread French defending forces in Indochina even thinner than previously. 3, they had produced renewed demands for a larger measure of political autonomy in both Laos and nearby Cambodia. 4, they had created a situation in which French spending in the area was raised by some $60 million. And 5, they had cost the United States some $460 million extra by way of foreign aid. One of the most interesting accounts of revolutionary warfare that has been written is ooh, Nguyen, I don't even know if that's right, Giap's own account of the Viet Minh strategy used to block the well publicized Navarre plan, France's last grasp effort, as it turned out, to regain the military initiative in Indochina. The plan, conceived by the latest of a succession of French commanders in chief, General Henry Navarre, envisioned a strategic offensive designed, as the late John Foster Dulles assured a committee of the United States Senate, to break the organized body of communist aggression by the end of the 1955 fighting season in 18 months. Navarre conceded privately in a secret report not published until long after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu that the war in Indochina was already lost when the Navarre plan went into effect. The best that they could hope for, even at the time, was a stalemate. Be that as it may, the plan was put.
Did the sound go off for y'all, or am I in the Matrix? Can y'all hear me? Can y'all hear? Can y'all hear Four Cups? Oh, so it's me. Okay, hold on. Oh no, y'all can't hear Four Cups. Okay, I'm gonna pick off where she left off. For if you hear me, I'm going to drop you down, but just come back. And of course, I'll give you the co host again. But I think your sound is out. Real quick, just to make sure, can y'all hear me now? Still? Go and give a thumbs up if y'all can hear me. So, okay, there we go. All right. So where she left off was okay. Navarre conceded privately in a secret report now published until long after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu that the war in Indochina was already lost when the Navarre plan went into effect. The best that could be hoped for, even at that time, was a stalemate. And real quick, just to remind people to check the comments, I put some more mutual aid posts that I saw on the timeline that I have bookmarked. I put them in the replies. So if y'all could share them and support it in whatever capacity you can. And also to look at the resources in the Jumbotron, there's the PDF, the previous spaces, as well as the space coming up on Monday. And also an important thread that I need y'all to support and also help spread awareness about. Okay, Navarre's strategy was to concentrate strong mobile forces in the Red River Delta in an effort to engage and wear down the main body of the Viet Minh during the fall of winter of 1953, while at the same time occupying Dien Bien Phu to the west as a springboard from which to launch powerful stabs at communist-free zones in the surrounding area. With the spring of 1954, the Viet Minh presumably being exhausted by this time, the French were to speed other newly formed units to seize Viet Minh free zones in South Vietnam. This mop-up to be followed by a general offensive in the north that would bring the war to a successful conclusion. 44 French mobile battalions were concentrated in the Red River Delta for the first phase of this operation. During the fall of 1953, and a series of fierce battles followed. In January, French paratroopers occupied Dien Bien Phu, and a powerful buildup there began. The Viet Minh, meanwhile, launched their counter-offensive, encircling the Dien Bien Phu, joining forces with the Lao for a stab into Upper Laos, followed in January by an offensive in the western highland, and 2 forward thrusts into Laos, one in the south and the other in the north, the latter liberating the Nam Hu Basin and threatening the Laotian capital, Luang Prong. So real quick, so as I'm going over like these details of these battles, right? What I'm thinking in my mind is like, just a few years before, they were trying to survive French colonialism, being exploited, being downtrodden and repressed, dehumanized. And literally, when they stood up, they're engaging in full-on guerrilla warfare, creating strategies on how to map out the terrains, which battalions to cover, when the enemy is asleep so they can cause agitation, what to sabotage and when, how to steal weapons, where the next weapons transport is going to be. All of a sudden, you become a new person under this revolutionary process. And that's what I get from reading this. So I know we can hear like a lot of numbers and, these events and, I'm in it. But also too, like, it's just real interesting that if you probably asked them before all this happened, if they were revolutionary, they'd be like, man, I just want to live, until the conditions got so that they couldn't live and they had to fight to live and then became revolutionary. It's amazing. In March, as the French regrouped to resume their own offensive, the Viet Minh opened their historic 55-day assault on Dien Phu. Let me see if Four Cups is back. Oh, I don't see her. Maybe her phone died or something. I'll check on her in a little bit. If anyone is mutuals with her, if you can DM her to make sure she's okay too. Okay, let's see. The strategic direction of the Dien Bien Phu campaign and of winter of 1953, spring of 1954 campaign in general, writes General Goliath, was a typical success of the revolutionary military line of Marxist-Leninism applied to the actual conditions of the Revolutionary War in Vietnam. Our strategy started from thorough analysis of the enemy's contradictions. It aimed at concentrating our forces in the enemy's relatively exposed sectors, annihilating their manpower, liberating a part of the territory, and compelling them to scatter their forces, thus creating favorable conditions for a decisive victory. For the French Expeditionary Corps, the war was a continuous process of dispersal of forces. The enemy divisions were split into regiments, then into battalions, companies, and platoons, and to be stationed at thousands of points and posts on the various battlefronts of the Indochina theater of operations. The enemy found himself face to face with a contradiction. Without scattering his forces, it would be impossible for him to occupy the invaded territory. In scattering his forces, he put himself in difficulties. The scattered units would fall easy prey to our troops. Their mobile forces would be more and more reduced, and the shortage of troops would be all the more acute. On the other hand, if they concentrated their forces to move from the defensive position and cope with us with more initiative, the occupation forces would be weakened, and it would be difficult for them to hold the invaded territory. Now, if the enemy gives up occupied territory, the very aim of the war of conquest is defeated. The objectives of the Nevers plan have already been stated. In preparing to put the plan into operation, the French found themselves faced with a dilemma. They could not go on the offensive without concentrating their manpower, yet would be unable to defend the many weak links in the strategic chain of defensive posts if they did concentrate it. Lack of manpower was the crippling factor. To make up for the deficiency, new units were formed. Many consisted of Vietnamese recruits or, as the Viet Minh insisted, mercenaries, and existing units stationed at posts that were considered static were secretly shifted for the big buildup in the Red River Delta. Needless to say, Nevers plan confronted the Viet Minh with the necessity of making serious decisions too. Giap recounts the dilemma. The concrete problem was the enemy was concentrating in the Red River Delta and launching attacks on our free zones. Now, should we concentrate our forces to face the enemy or mobilize them for attacks in other directions? In concentrating our forces to fight the enemy in the Delta, we could defend our free zone, but here the enemy was still strong, and we could easily be decimated. On the other hand, in attacking in other directions with our main forces, we could exploit the vulnerable points of the enemy to annihilate the bulk of their forces. But our free zones would thus be threatened. Damn, what a dilemma. The Communist Party's Central Committee put its collective mind to the problem. Giap soberly relates and came up with a slogan: Dynamism, initiative, mobility, and rapidity? Whew, that was a tongue twister for me. Rapidity of decisions in the face of new situations. While less than informative, the slogan did have meaning, as Giap explains. Keeping the initiative, we should concentrate our forces to attack strategic points which were relatively vulnerable. If we succeeded in keeping the initiative, we could achieve successes and compel the enemy to scatter their forces. On the other hand, if we were driven on the defensive, not only could we not annihilate many enemy forces, but our own force could easily suffer losses. A dynamic campaign was decided upon. Always convinced that the essential thing was to destroy the enemy's manpower, the Central Committee worked out its plan of action by scientific analysis to concentrate our offense against important strategic points where the enemy were relatively weak in order to wipe out a part of their manpower. At the same time, compelling them to scatter their forces to cope with us at vital points, which that had to defend at all costs. This strategy proved correct. While the enemy was concentrating big forces in the Delta to threaten our free zones, instead of leaving our main forces in the Delta or scattering our forces in the free zone to defend it by defensive action, we regrouped our forces and boldly attacked in the direction of the Northwest. The result was the destruction, says Giap, of thousands of local bandits armed by the French and the liberation of 4 strategic strongpoints, the destruction of the greater part of the French column and the encirclement of Dien Bien Phu, thus compelling the enemy to carry out in haste a reinforcement movement to save it from being wiped out. Giap adds a significant observation. In addition to the Red River Delta, Dien Bien Phu thus became a second point of concentration of enemy forces. At the same time, the Middle Laos offensive was in progress, forcing the French to rush more reinforcements in another direction and to weaken further the buildup in the Delta, while creating a third point of concentration at the threatened airbase of Sino. Further divisions were created, including a Viet Minh assault on the Western Highlands and the offensive in Upper Laos, sending French reinforcements spreading in 2 directions. This is a quote. For us, writes Giap, the first phase of the winter-spring campaign was a series of offensives launched simultaneously on various important sectors where the enemy were relatively exposed, and in which we annihilated part of the enemy's forces. and liberated occupied areas, at the same time compelling the enemy to scatter their forces in many directions. We continually kept the initiative in the operations and drove the enemy on the defense. On the main battlefront, we pinned down the enemy at Dien Bien Phu, thus creating favorable conditions for our troops on other battlefields. The result of the Viet Minh strategy was to relieve pressure on the free zones to such an extent that our compatriots could go to work even in daytime without being molested by enemy aircraft, and to keep the French too busy and too scattered for the local mopping up operations which the Nevers plan had envisioned as the prelude to general offense against the main body of Vietnamese forces in the north. In consequence, guerrilla areas behind the French lines in South Vietnam were never eliminated, and with this constant threat added to the pressure on encircled Dien Bien Phu, French hopes of regaining the initiative quickly faded. The Nevers plan was smashed before it could be fairly put into operation. The destruction of the fortified camp at Dien Bien Phu and the surrender of what remained of its garrison at full strength, it had consisted of 17 infantry battalions, 3 artillery battalions, and plus various engineer tank units and paratroopers defending 49 concrete strongposts, was the decisive blow. The battle lasted for 55 days. At 1:53 a.m. local time on May 8, 1954, writes Bernard Fall, the last guns fell silent at Dien Bien Phu after a desperate bayonet charge of the Algerian and Foreign Legion garrison of Strongpoint. Isabel had been smothered, and Isabel's in quotes, had been smothered by sheer numbers of the victorious Vietnamese, and the war had lasted 8 years was almost over. The military survey team sent to Saigon from France to learn the extent of the disaster recommended that the French abandon North Vietnam as a lost cause, and if they could, hold the area below the 17th parallel. The diplomatic settlement in Geneva that followed, bringing peace to Vietnam but not permanent peace, ratified the military decision. An Indochina war ended on July 21st, 1954 at 3:43 a.m., writes Fall, ever precise. It had cost the French Union forces a total of 172,000 casualties. Damn. And forever broken France's hold on Vietnam. That's the end of chapter 5. And it's almost going to be an hour. I could start on chapter 6. Chapter 6 is the political character of the Second Indo War and American role in expansion. But I think I'm going to stop here because this text is like more like, oh, is she back? Let me see. I don't see her. But this text has a lot of information, and I do encourage people to go back and listen to it and research some of these points. And so I'm going to let this space just sit for an hour, and I'll schedule another one for probably later on in the week. It might be around Friday. But I will also encourage y'all to look into Jumbotron because I do have a space kept scheduled for Martin Luther King Day, and it's called The Death of a King. And basically it details the last year of his life, how he was rejected by the Black middle class, the way the media just dragged his name and his reputation through the mud, the way he was rejected by a lot of his own people, and how when he would sleep, he would have night terrors every night. He had to drink alcohol in order to like fall asleep. A lot of the shit that we don't know, that the wear and trauma on a person's body when they dedicate themselves to liberating their people, we're going to detail in this book. So it's very interesting, and I encourage everyone to look up in the Jumbotron for it. I think it's the second to last and fourth from the front. And if you can make it, it's also recorded so you can revisit it anytime. With that, no pressure. If anyone wants to ask for a mic, we can have a discussion. And if not, that's cool. Let me check the comments to make sure there's not questions there that I missed. Jamie J put in the comment section, the spook who sat by the door. I can't tell if that's the link. I hope that is. I think it's the YouTube link also included. But yeah, that is what guerrilla warfare looks like in an urban setting. And I encourage y'all to look at that movie. It's very interesting. It is my favorite movie. And someone says, this is the... So I got a phone call. Someone says, this is the second French General Leclerc taking an L after one in Haiti. I thought the same thing. That's mad funny. And yeah, also to just check the replies for mutual aids as well. So with that, I don't see any requests, which is all good. I'm going to go ahead and end the space and remind y'all to look out for each other and to take care of each other. And above all, let's get free.